One of the most significant roads to revolution in 1916 began here in the fishing port of Howth in County Dublin in July 1914, because it was here that the arms were landed for the Irish volunteers from the yacht Asgard, skippered by Erskine Childers. The background to this was the Home Rule crisis. In 1911-1912, the British Liberal government had introduced a Home Rule Bill which would have given very limited autonomy to Ireland within the British Empire. That promise of Home Rule was threatened by armed unionism in North East Ulster in alliance with the British Tory party, officially called the Conservative and Unionist Party. And these forces, largely in pursuit of British political ends within Britain against the Liberal government, stirred up sectarianism in North East Ulster. They founded the Ulster Volunteer Force. They were armed and officered by, in many cases, by British officers, retired British officers of the British Army. In response, Irish nationalists decided that they would form the Irish Volunteers, Óglaigh na hÉireann, as a nationalist force, non-sectarian, open to people of all religions and none. And the Irish Republican Brotherhood was very much involved in the background in the establishment of the Irish Volunteers. But they were largely an unarmed force. And in early 1914, a committee came together, ironically not in Dublin but in London, to support the Irish Volunteers with the purchase of arms. On that committee were Roger Casement, the historian Alice Stopford Green, Darrell Figgis and a number of others. And they came together to purchase arms to raise the funds. Darrell Figgis and Erskine Childers went to Germany, to Hamburg, where they purchased 1,500 Mauser rifles. These were an old model of rifle from the German army, and they were single shot. They were obviously less up to date and modern than the British Army weapons, but they were what they could obtain at the time. These weapons were taken on board a tug from Hamburg in July 1914. On the 12th of July, the tug rendezvoused with the Asgard and with the Kelpie, the two yachts who took on board the weapons, 900 on the Asgard and 600 on the Kelpie, and they began their voyage back to Ireland. They took the rifles then through the English Channel and the Irish Sea. At one stage, the Asgard passed through a number of British warships. It also passed through one of the worst storms in the Irish Sea, until finally they reached here on the Sunday, the 26th of July 1914. Here to meet them were Irish volunteers and members of Féin. Among the leaders who are here would be future leaders of the 1916 Rising, including Eamon Cant, Thomas McDonagh, the O'Rahilly. Among the rank and file volunteers were Arthur Griffith. Cathal Brua was here earlier on the Sunday with a number of members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB, who were here to scout the area and ensure that the Dublin Metropolitan Police, the RIC and the British Army had not been warned of the arms landing. We're at the East Pier in Howth. This is the lighthouse, and it was around the point of the East Pier here that the Asgard small white yacht appeared on the 26th of July 1914, a Sunday afternoon. And here to greet it were 800 members of the Irish Volunteers and Féin and the Republican Scouts. On board the Asgard were 900 rifles and tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition destined for the Irish Volunteers. They had been brought from Germany by the skipper Erskine Childers and his crew, Molly Childers, his wife, Mary Springrice, Gordon Shepherd, and two Donegal fishermen, Charles Duggan and Patrick McGinley. The Asgard had waited at Lambay Island, beyond Ireland's Eye here, for the signal from Howth. A boat was to go out to the sound here and give a signal. Unfortunately for them, that never happened. So Erskine Childers had to take the chance, to take the decision. Do we bring the weapons in, risk their capture, he took the chance, and as it happened, coincidentally, just as the volunteers marched to the end of the pier, the Asgard sailed into the harbour and the guns were unloaded. And this was, of course, a precursor and a major pivotal event leading up to the 1916 Rising. When the volunteers took the arms from the Asgard, they marched back along the East Pier, and here along the seafront they began their march into Dublin. Now, the authorities, the British authorities, the Army and the Dublin Metropolitan Police and Royal Irish Constabulary, they had no suspicion that there was an arms landing, so there were no police, no British soldiers here. The Irish volunteers on the previous 2 Sundays had a regular route march to Howth, so the authorities had no suspicion. They thought it was a regular route march by the Irish volunteers. It began here on the pier, onto the main road here and into the city, the road into Dublin City, and they were then halted at Clontarf by the British authorities, who had only at that stage been alerted to what had happened here. We're here now in Fairview, where the first confrontation between the volunteers and the British authorities took place after the Asgard landing in Howth. The volunteers marched all the way from Howth to here, Clontarf, Fairview, and at the bottom of the Howth Road there was a cordon made up of members of the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary, the Dublin Metropolitan Police and the British Army. They tried to halt the volunteers and to take their weapons from them. The volunteers, of course, refused. They drew up themselves in a line facing the British forces. There was a sharp confrontation here. The British Army withdrew bayonets and fixed bayonets to their rifles and attacked the volunteers. One volunteer, Captain Judge, was injured by a bayonet. There was almost an open fight. Some of the volunteer officers fired their revolvers, but calm was restored, and what the volunteers did was they kept the men in the front ranks in place, and the men behind moved away across the fields as they were then with their rifles. So the vast majority of the guns landed at Howth got away safely on foot, in taxis and on bicycles, and they were hidden in arms dumps across the city of Dublin. We're here on Bachelor's Walk, and it was on Bachelor's Walk that the shootings that ended the day in tragedy on the 26th of July 1914. The volunteers had escaped the British Army and RIC cordon at Clontarf, and the guns had been got away safely. Word had filtered back through Dublin City that the police and the British Army had been evaded and that the rifles for the volunteers had been gotten away safely. And as the British Army Regiment unit, which was in Clontarf, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, as they marched back through the city, they were jeered by crowds who had heard the news that the guns had successfully been gotten into the hands of the volunteers. And there were confrontations in several places with crowds who were jeering the British Army. But here on Bachelor's Walk, they were jeered again by the crowd, and the officer ordered them to turn around, the front rank to kneel down and to take aim, and he ordered them then to fire. They fired into the crowd, and there were 3 people killed on the spot. Mary Duffy, James Brennan and Patrick Quinn were shot dead by the British Army here on Bachelor's Walk, and over 30 people were injured. The significance of this, obviously a tragedy for the families and the people who were killed, but also nationalists and republicans drew the conclusion that clearly there was one law for the Ulster Volunteer Force, who were able to import a huge consignment of weapons without any interference from the British Army or the RIC, and another law for the Irish Volunteers, because when they imported their weapons, a much smaller number, blood was shed on the streets of Dublin by the British Army.